Now live coverage of the U.S. Senate on C-SPAN 2.
Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty God, whose kingdom is above all earthly kingdoms, and who judges all lesser sovereignties, give our lawmakers this day clean hands and pure hearts to serve you and your people. Equip them with grace, strength, and wisdom to make our nation and world better for the glory of your name. Lord, infuse them with a creativity that will empower them to do their work according to your will. Give them peace of soul when their thoughts and plans are right, and disturb them when they drift from what is best. Lead them in paths of righteousness and truth. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., January 25, 2011, to the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Stand-in Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jeanne Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Alexander.
Majority Leader,
I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be vitiated.
without objection.
Madam President, following any leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business. Senators be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each. The Senate will recess from 12:30 until 2:15 p.m. today, and that's for our weekly caucus luncheons. I'll continue to work with my colleagues on the Senate rules and committee assignments, as I have the last week or so. At 9 o'clock tonight, the President will deliver his State of the Union address to Congress. Senators are asked to gather.
Mr. Leader, Senate will be in order.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Grateful to you. At 9 o'clock, the President will address the nation from the House chambers. Senators are asked to gather here in the Senate chamber at 8:30 so we can proceed to a body to the House of Representatives. And we'll leave here about 8:40, 8:45 this evening. Madam President, in the 2 weeks we were away from Washington, all of us absorbed a numbing tragedy, that horrific attack in Tucson, Arizona. The nation mourned the loss, thanked the heroes, and waited anxiously by a brave Congresswoman's hospital bedside. We continue to wish victims a full and speedy recovery and continue to keep their families in our thoughts. In the days since the Senate last convened, the nation also resumed a debate over the words, the tone, and the metaphors we use here in the Senate, as well as along the campaign trail, on the Internet, and over the airwaves. The national conversation about our national conversation is not new. It happens every year. Candidates promise in every election. But since the shooting in Tucson, calls for more careful language have multiplied and been amplified. There is no evidence that partisan politics played any role in this monstrous attack. Even so, we should be more civil anyway. Being more mindful of the weight of our words always helps. We have much more to gain than to lose from civility and discretion. In this new year, I hope we'll return to the respect that has always been a hallmark of the United States Senate. I hope my colleagues will join in renewing our commitment to productive debate. Some may be inspired by the town halls of 2 Augusts ago, others by the heated election debates. Some may be motivated by the conversation that started after Tucson, Arizona. And many will seek more civility simply because it's the right thing to do. Whatever the reason, I hope to turn to more responsible rhetoric is more than empty rhetoric. I intend to do my part. What I'm talking about goes beyond inflammatory allegations or hate speech. It also means not questioning others' motives or calling into question the patriotism of a colleague who's been elected to serve his state and his country. But it's even more than that. And we more carefully as we more carefully choose our words, we must also remember what we do. We don't have the luxury, as Senator Moynihan used to caution, to choose our own facts. If we're really going to change the way we speak and hope to change the way we do business, we have to reintroduce truth into the public debate. This doesn't mean just rephrasing an attack line from job killing to job destroying, as House Republicans have done in response to the shooting. It means that if there's no proof that a policy takes away jobs, if in fact the evidence shows the opposite, we shouldn't pretend any differently. The nonpartisan referee we rely on for this data, the Congressional Budget Office, found that when it comes to health reform, which is what House Republicans are talking about in this case, the claim is simply not true. Changing our rhetoric requires us to debate facts, not invent them. In the coming weeks, much of the discussion on the Senate floor will revolve around health care, the deficit and debt limit, those three things. Each of these issues affects the #1 issue in America, jobs, and each issue is complex. If we're going to make the right decisions and point our economy back in the right direction, we have to start with a shared respect for the facts. First, let's look at health care. Independent fact-checkers examined all the political rhetoric of last year. Given the intensity of the legislative debates and the election season, there was a lot to choose from. But one claim stood out above all, the habit of those opposed to health care to call it a government takeover. One of those nonpartisan experts, factcheck.org, called it plainly false. Another, Political Fact, a project of the St. Petersburg, Florida Times, called it the lie of the year. So if we're going to have an honest debate about health reform law we passed last year, retiring the scare tactic would be a good place to start. The deficit. Madam President, my friends on the other side are quick to associate the current president with the current deficit as if it happened overnight and under his watch. But here is a brief review of the facts. In the 1990s, we balanced the budget under the direction of President Clinton. At the beginning of the next century, America had a bigger surplus than ever in its history. Over the next decade, while our troops went into battle, the cost of 2 wars went off budget. The richest took home giant tax breaks, but nobody paid the bill. A massive prescription drug program wasn't paid for either. President Clinton left President Bush a record surplus. President Bush left President Obama a record deficit. Those unpaid for wars, tax breaks, and programs are the reason we're in a hole today. What we do next is fair game for debate. But facts, as President John Adams said, are stubborn things. Finally, Madam President, the debt limit. We'll soon debate the debt limit. Earlier this month, the Secretary of the Treasury, Timothy Geithner, sent each of us a letter outlining what would happen if we don't raise that ceiling. It would be the first time in the history of America that our country would default on our legal obligations. He didn't share his partisan opinion in that letter. He simply laid out the facts. This is what he wrote, and I quote, "Default would effectively impose a significant and long-lasting tax on all Americans and all American businesses and could lead to the loss of millions of American jobs. Even a short-term or limited default would have catastrophic economic consequences that would last for decades." End of quote. What are some of those consequences? Our troops and veterans would no longer get their paychecks. Our seniors would no longer get the Social Security and Medicare checks that they're entitled. Student loans would simply stop. On a larger scale, the Secretary of Treasury warned it would lead to a worse financial crisis than one we're still recovering from. There soon will be lots of time to debate what we do about the debt limit. But these are the facts we must first acknowledge and consider. So finally, Madam President, the American people voted in November for a divided legislative branch of government, a Democratic Senate and a Republican House. They didn't elect houses led by competing political parties because they want us to compete. They did so because they want us to cooperate. We cannot cooperate without an honest debate, and we cannot have an honest debate if we insist that fiction is fact. Mark Twain, a great Nevadan, once said, "If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything." He was right. Here's one thing every senator should remember and never forget. Though there are many different points of view in this body, we all share the same reality. Madam President, I look forward to a productive Congress, and we can do that by debating the facts. Before I turn this over to my friend, the Republican leader, I ask consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration H. Conres 10, which we received from the House and is at the desk, and that the concurrent resolution be agreed to, the motion to consider be laid on the table, and that no intervening action or debate take place, and that any statements related to the measure be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
With that, is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
Madam President, I'd like to start this morning by acknowledging the news from last week that 3 of our colleagues will be leaving us when their current terms expire. Senator Hutchinson has been a trusted advisor of mine, a leader in the Senate, and a dear friend. Senator Conrad has been a leader on the budget. He's done a lot to alert the country to the fiscal problems we face as a nation. And Senator Lieberman has been a consistent and courageous leader on defense and national security issues. We'll be sorry to see them go. They've all been a great credit to this body. Now, Madam President, every grade schooler in America knows that all 3 branches of the federal government in Washington are equal. But as every member of Congress quickly learns, the President sets the agenda. And never is that more apparent than on the day of the State of the Union address. This year, the President will be speaking to a Congress that looks very different from the one he spoke to last year. The voters sent a clear message in November that when it comes to jobs and the economy, the administration's policies have done far more damage than good. And one very positive thing that the President could do tonight is to acknowledge that they have a point. He's tried to do so indirectly in recent weeks by hiring new staff, by speaking in tones of moderation, but it takes more than a change in tone to improve the economy. It takes more than a change in tone to reduce the debt. It takes more than a change in tone to help create the right conditions for private sector job growth. It takes a change in policy. And the early signals suggest that the President isn't quite there yet. The President has talked recently about working together to improve a regulatory climate that stifles business innovation and job growth. Yet he hasn't acknowledged the extent to which his own policies have stifled growth. Over the past 2 years, his administration has issued more than 130 economically significant new rules, or 40% more than the annual rate under the last 2 presidents. What's worse, the new health care bill will alone create 159 new bureaucratic entities and is exempt from the President's proposed regulatory reforms. The health care bill, which will create 159 new bureaucratic entities, is exempt from the President's proposed regulatory reforms. Now, this is bad news for small business who are already struggling to get by in a down economy and who are now grappling with how to afford all the new mandates in the new health care bill. The President has talked about streamlining and reducing the burden of government, yet the health care bill he signed is already increasing the cost of care and forcing people out of their existing coverage. The debate over this bill continues, and the President and Democrats in Congress continue to defend it. But when nearly 2/3 of doctors surveyed predict that it will make health care in America worse, not better, Americans are right to be concerned. It should tell us something that 19 doctors currently in Congress, 18 of them support repeal of the health care bill. The President has talked about the need to cut spending and reduce the debt. Yet over the last 2 years, his policies have added more than $3 trillion to the national debt, much of it through a stimulus that promised to keep unemployment, now hovering just below double digits, from rising above 8%. And now we hear that he plans to stick with the same failed approach of economic growth through even more government spending with a call for, quote, investments, end quote, in education, infrastructure, research, and renewable energy. We've seen before what Democrats in Washington mean by investments. In promoting the failed stimulus, the President referred to that, too, as an investment in our nation's future. 14 times alone during his signing statement, he referred to the stimulus bill's investments. We all know how that turned out. The first stimulus, we were told, would include critical so-called investments in education, infrastructure, scientific research, and renewable energy. The same areas we're told he'll focus on tonight. Only later did we learn that some of these critical investments included things like repairs on tennis courts, a study on the mating decisions of cactus bugs, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a plant database, and a $535 million loan to a California solar panel maker, which, instead of hiring 1,000 new workers, as planned, just laid off 175 instead. This is what happens, Madam President, when the government decides to pick winners and losers without considering what the marketplace really wants. Competitors are left out in the cold, employees get a false sense of security, and taxpayers are left holding the bag. Unfortunately, the President doesn't seem to have learned this lesson quite yet. But taxpayers now know that when Democrats talk about investments, they should grab their wallets. So I'm all for the President changing his tune, but unless he has a time machine, he can't change his record. And if we're going to make any real progress in the areas of spending, debt, and reining in government, the President will have to acknowledge that the policies of the past 2 years are not only largely to blame for the situation we find ourselves in, but that unless we do something to reverse their ill effects, the road to recovery and prosperity will be a bumpy one. The President has spoken in tones of a moderate many times. He did so in his campaign. He's done so in countless speeches. He's got a knack for it. I have no doubt he'll do so again tonight. But speeches only last for as long as they're delivered. Americans are more interested in what follows the speech. And in the case of this administration, Americans have a good reason to be skeptical. Time and time again, the President has spoken in a way that appeals to many, then governed in a way that doesn't. My hope is that he'll leave that method aside. A better path, in my view, is the one Republicans have been proposing for 2 years, one that respects both the wishes of the public and the two-party system. Last year, just prior to the President's State of the Union, I proposed a number of areas where I thought the two parties could find common ground and work together to help the economy. The President ignored just about everything I proposed. So when the pundits ask whether there are areas where the two parties could come together, I would say yes. I've proposed several of them, but the Democrats don't seem to be interested. Some have suggested that in this new post-election environment, I might find a more receptive audience. So in the spirit of bipartisanship, I'd like to propose once again a few areas where I believe the two parties can work together in the weeks and months ahead. I believe the parties can and should work together on energy initiatives that expand America's domestic energy supply and make us less reliant on foreign sources. On expanding exports and creating jobs through free trade agreements with Panama, Colombia, and South Korea. And on reforming corporate taxes so American businesses are more competitive in an increasingly global marketplace. These are just a few of the things we can do beyond the symbolic gestures and the posturing to help the economy. Beyond that, we must work to cut spending and to rein in the size and scope and cost of government. The voters have been crystal clear on this point. By proposing more government spending tonight, the President is not only defying their will, he's refusing to learn the clear lesson of the failed stimulus. Government may create debt, but it doesn't create jobs. So I think we have a lot of work to do in bringing the two parties together on a program that will actually address the problems we face. But there are reasons for optimism. The President's change in tone is an acknowledgment, at least, that something has to change, as was his willingness to work with Republicans last month on keeping taxes from going up on anyone. In the coming weeks and months, Americans will be looking for him to come around on spending and debt as well. And Republicans will be working hard to persuade him to do so. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam President. Last week, the President of China came to Chicago. He had visited Washington, D.C.
Will the senator hold? Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. The senator from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam President. As I was saying last week, President Hu Jintao of China came to Chicago after visiting Washington, and he was received in a gala manner in that great city, and I happened to be there for the dinner. There were leaders of the community and business all there because China's become an important part of American life. It wasn't that long ago that China was really stuck in the past. We can recall the Chinese in their green quilted identical clothes on their bicycles holding their little red books of the Chairman Mao's great quotations and basically being discounted and dismissed as not a major factor. In the world economy today, China is a major factor, and that's why the remarks of the Republican minority leader need to be put in that perspective. The real question the President will ask us tonight is, America ready to compete in the 21st century? Do we have what it takes to regain the edge when it comes to manufacturing jobs and to be competitive? The challenge the President offers us is to do the responsible thing when it comes to our budgeting, but not to forget the investments necessary in our future. When I look at how the United States is likely to succeed, you have to start with education and training. We have to have an educated workforce, the best in the world. We have to reward innovation, provide the kind of research incentives at the federal government level that lead to the commercialization of products and ultimately manufacture and production that grows our economy. If we walk away from that, Madam President, if we say that the United States can no longer afford to invest in America, we are walking away from what is essential for our competitive edge. And when I hear the Republican leaders stand up and say we can't afford these investments in America anymore, I really wonder what his vision is when it comes to our competitive edge. I think it's important that we maintain that. And the President is going to do that, I believe, in the context of responsible budgeting. For the record, Madam President, we had a deficit commission proposed on a bipartisan basis last year by Senator Conrad and Senator Gregg, and it was a commission that came up for a vote on the floor of the United States Senate. Does the senator from New Hampshire remember what happened? We failed to pass this deficit commission when 7 Republican senators who were co-sponsors came down and voted against it. The President had no choice at that point but to start an executive commission, which I was proud to serve on. And that executive commission didn't have the binding authority that the legislative commission did, which was defeated by the Republicans on the floor of the Senate. So now, as they pose for holy pictures in deficit reduction, they want us to erase that memory of 7 Republican senators, co-sponsors, who turned and reversed their position when it came to this deficit commission. I served on this commission. The one thing that the commission reminded us of over and over is when we hit the deficit break, don't hit it too soon, or we could skid off the road. We could be back into a deeper recession if we're not careful. There's good news, Madam President. Not as much as we'd like, but there's good news. The CNN opinion research poll released this morning says the percent of the American people that feel things are going well is up 14 points since December. And they said, the polling director said, we haven't seen numbers like this since April of 2007. One likely reason for the change is the public's growing optimism about the economy. Why is it that this good news about the economy makes the Republicans feel so sad and gloomy? It's an indication we are moving in the right direction. When the senator from Kentucky gets up and says, government just creates debt, it doesn't create jobs, that wasn't the speech we heard when we extended the tax cuts. Exactly the opposite was said on the floor of the Senate. Republican senators stood up and said, give tax cuts to people and they are going to be able to spend more money for goods and services and have more confidence in the future. That was a government decision endorsed by the President and a strong bipartisan majority in the Senate and the House. The government can work in a positive way. And let me say one word about health care. I listened carefully as Republican after Republican comes to the floor to decry the notion that there would be a government-administered health care plan. Now, it's not a government health insurance plan. It's private health insurance administered through the government and insurance exchanges to give everybody a chance to have health insurance. But those who stand up on the other side and decry government-administered health insurance plans are, in fact, insured under a government-administered health care plan called the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. So I would basically say this. We all know the Hippocratic Oath, and we all know the saying, physician, heal thyself. I would say to those Republican senators calling for repeal of health care for the rest of America that first, senators, repeal your own. Step away from the government-administered health care plan if you find it so objectionable for the rest of America, then reject it when it comes to your own health insurance. Members of the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, I think without exception, are all members of a government-administered health care plan. If it's good enough for members of the Senate, why isn't it good enough for the rest of America? That, I think, is the basics. And let me close by saying this. When it comes to trade agreements, I believe we should have good ones. Ones that are fair to American workers and businesses, ones that are enforced when there are unfair trade practices. But we've got to be careful as well that we have a tax code that also rewards good conduct by American business. Our tax code currently subsidizes American corporations that want to ship production overseas. Why in the world would we spend $1 in our tax money to reward a company that wants to remove a job from America? Over and over again, we have begged the Republicans to join us in a bipartisan effort to end this subsidy for shipping jobs overseas. That will be a good way to build the economy here in America, create good-paying jobs here at home, and invest in a country which has a bright future if we don't get caught up in the political rhetoric of the day. And I yield the floor.
The Senator from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to call time out from this partisan discussion to speak for a moment about the events in Tucson of January 8th. It's the first opportunity I've had to address my colleagues about the tragedy of that day. And the theme that I'd like to discuss is the goodness of people, because if anything if I've gotten any lesson from this, after meeting and talking with all of the people who I could involved in this tragedy, the overwhelming notion of the goodness of people is what I am most left with. Tomorrow, Senator McCain and I will offer a resolution in support of the victims of the shooting, offering condolences to those who were lost and their loved ones, and our prayers for the recovery of those who were injured, and to express appreciation for those who engaged in real acts of heroism. And we'll have more formally to talk about when we do that tomorrow. But I just wanted to share some thoughts from my heart based on my interaction with the people over the last 2 weeks after this event occurred. And it begins with the proposition that Tucson likes to call itself a town, not a city. Now, it's over 500,000 people. But you're all familiar with communities which, though large in numbers, seem small because people work together, they play together, they have a sense of community and of helping and working with each other. And that is Tucson, where my wife and I both attended the University of Arizona. The Safeway where this event occurred is only 2 blocks from my Tucson office. And the head of my Tucson office and his staff were at the Safeway Saturday morning shopping, and they left about 7 or 8 minutes before this occurred. Judge John Roll, who is a very close friend and attended Mass virtually every morning, had just come from Mass, and had decided to come to the Safeway to express his appreciation to Representative Gabrielle Giffords. They were friends. Among other things, he wanted to tell her that he appreciated her signing a letter along with Representative Grijalva that supported the Arizona Federal District Court in its desire to be named an emergency district by the commission that does that for the federal courts because of the overwhelming caseload in that court. Judge Rohl, though he had significant administrative responsibilities, kept a full caseload himself because to do otherwise would have been to put part of the burden onto his colleagues. So he was really carrying two separate loads, administering a very, very busy court, at the same time acting as a judge on all of his cases. And part of the things that he and I had been working on, in fact, Senator Barrasso, Senator Lemieux, and I had lunch with Judge Rohl the Friday after the election to talk about how we could strengthen the courts, especially because of the crushing caseload from drug and immigration cases, because that is the district that's right down on the border. And part of his work, and that I was working with him on, was to try to find ways to ameliorate the load of his court and potentially get some additional magistrates, if not judges, to help handle the case load. When Representative Giffords decided to hold this Congress on Your Corner event, many of the people in her Tucson staff went with her to the event. They're very devoted to her, and I don't know of anyone that enjoys meeting with constituents more than Representative Giffords. So she had several staff people there, too. When the gunman came, he immediately headed for her. His intention was obviously to do her harm. But right after shooting Representative Giffords, he began to shoot the people on her staff and the others waiting in line to talk to her. And this is where some of the goodness of the people just comes out. I mean, I talk about the goodness of the people. Judge Rohl, who didn't have to say thank you to Representative Giffords, but he went out of his way to try to do that. When Ron Barber, Representative Giffords, the head of her Tucson staff, was shot, Judge Rohl, the cameras show, pushed him down under a table and put his body over Ron Barber's body, and thus took the bullet that killed John Rohl's life. Talk about the goodness of people. And everyone in Tucson and in Arizona who knew Judge Rohl at his funeral spoke not just of his abilities as a jurist and his public service, but his goodness, his love for his wife Maureen, their 3 sons, their grandchildren, and incidentally 3 of his grandchildren spoke. It was so moving when they talked about the love that they had for their grandfather, who took a lot of time with each of them to teach them how to swim, to play basketball, and so on. The goodness of people. Representative Giffords' staff were there. They liked her and were very willing to be with her on a Saturday morning when they could have been doing something else with their families. Gabe Zimmerman, just 30 years old, was one of those staff people, and he too lost his life. My staff in Tucson really enjoyed working with Gabe. Now, I'm a Republican, they're Republicans. Gabe is a Democrat working for a Democrat representative. That didn't matter to them. They really enjoyed working together for the same constituents. And I'll tell you, my Tucson staff is taking his loss very, very hard. There were others from his staff who were there, one of whom is an intern that we're going to see this evening. He's going to be sitting in the president's box. His name is Daniel Hernandez, and we saw him on at the ceremony in Tucson at the University of Arizona on Wednesday after the shooting. He was one of the people who immediately went to Representative Giffords' aid and continued to staunch her bleeding, the goodness of people, his unselfless act to help her. Pam Simon was another one of her staffers who was shot. And I had a chance to visit with Pam in the hospital, and then after, there she is with wounds. A bullet went in and out of her arm and another in her leg, and just couldn't wait to get back to work, and she has done so now. The other people who were shot there, Christina Taylor Green is the 9-year-old, and the things that were said about her remind me so much of my granddaughter, my youngest granddaughter. Just the hugest heart you can ever imagine. Athletic and yet studious, interested in government, all the things you'd want in a young woman. And President Obama spoke eloquently about her in his remarks on that Wednesday. She was taken to the event with a friend who just wanted to expose her to Representative Giffords and a little bit about our government. Dorothy Morris. Now, I didn't know Dorothy, but I knew her husband, George. They had communicated with me, and I visited with George a couple of times. After this event, he's a retired Marine. But I'll tell you, he's having a hard time with this because he said that Dot, his wife, would follow him. His words, she would follow me to hell. Well, she's obviously in a different place, and he is going to be as well. But the fact that she didn't particularly want to go that morning, but he's a Republican. He wanted to go talk to Representative Giffords because he thought he could talk to her just in the way that we do, about issues and have a good conversation with somebody that he didn't totally agree with, and then saved his wife's life. Dorwin and Mattie Stoddard. Dorwin was killed. His whole recent life was devoted to service at his church. I visited with Mattie at her home. Her two daughters were there. A very good friend of ours, Ed Biggers from Tucson, who also attends their church. And just the kindness of all of those people and the way they talked about the others involved, as well as you could see the members of family and friends helping each other, was, as I said, an impression that will stick with me forever. Phyllis Schneck, who everyone agreed was a wonderful grandmother, spent her winters in Tucson. She lived in New Jersey. But all of these folks were human beings with friends, with family, with futures, and to have all of them taken from us is a real tragedy. What can we take from that? I won't, at this time, I think I've gone almost 10 minutes, and I'll mention tomorrow some of the other heroes. I'll just take a second with some of them, though. Bill Badger, a retired Army colonel, didn't want to talk about his heroism, but he helped to subdue the assailant. Anna Ballas, who has two sons, both of whom are U.S. Marines who have done repeated tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. She was in the Safeway, came out, and immediately began administering to Ron Barber. I went to visit Ron in the hospital at the same time that Anna had gotten there a few minutes before, and Ron was holding her hand the entire time, saying, "This is the lady who saved my life." And just a tremendous act of selfless courage on her part, and just showing, again, the wonderful humanity of all of the people there. Steve Rail, a doctor, a former emergency room doc, was there, helped to subdue the assailant, and so on. And there are many others. We will talk about some of the others tomorrow when we express more formally our views on this resolution. And I know that all of our colleagues will want to join us in supporting this resolution to let the folks of Tucson know that we appreciate what they have endured here. We appreciate the heroism. Our prayers are with the victims, and our hearts go out to all of those who were injured in some way or other. But from this, among the lessons that we learn is that people have innate goodness. Now, we all have a side of us that we wish we didn't have sometimes, too, frequently expressed on the floor of this body. But maybe for a little while we can acknowledge the fact that there is goodness in everyone, and I saw so much of that in all of these people drawn from all over the community, different walks of life, different political parties, different ages, and yet when they came together, what was most obvious? It was their sacrifice and their goodness, and I think that that is something that should be a lesson to all of us. I will tomorrow speak more formally, as I said, about this resolution, but I am deeply grateful for the expressions of condolence and support that all of my colleagues have presented, both to me and to Senator McCain.
Madam President, I certainly grieve and also appreciate all of the remarks of the distinguished senator from Arizona. What a tragedy. But there are heroes there as well, and I appreciate his remarks. Madam President, in recent months, President Obama has frequently discussed our nation's disturbing fiscal situation. He is right to do so. Our yearly deficits and accumulated debt hang over the futures of our children and grandchildren like a sword of Damocles. Though he was late to the table on this issue, President Obama seems to have finally recognized the frustration and anger of the American people over our federal fiscal policies. Recognizing that you have a problem is an important first step, and I applaud the administration for speaking about our nation's structural deficits. But this is a critical issue. and any solution will require that those responsible give a full and fair accounting of the policies that have led to this crisis. Unfortunately, rather than own up to his own administration's complicity in our fiscal imbalance, the President prefers to blame our current and future fiscal problems on previous administrations, or on the previous administration. For this President, the buck always seems to stop over there. This trope is getting old. Well before citizens began organizing against this administration and its historic spending spree, the President and his Democratic allies in Congress were justifying their stimulus program by blaming the previous administration. Yet trying to pass off the consequences of the last 2 years on a long-retired president and a Congress that ended over 4 years ago was no longer plausible. Try as they might, revisionist fiscal history will not absolve our friends on the other side for the fiscal decisions made on their watch. I'll explain that point separately and in detail in a few days. It is well past time that this administration stop pointing fingers. The American people are demanding that their elected representatives in Congress and the White House act like adults and fix this fiscal mess. In a few weeks, President Obama will send Congress his third budget. The fact that Treasury Secretary Geithner has already written us requesting legislation to raise the debt ceiling does not bode well for citizens seeking greater spending restraint from this administration. The people of Utah and of this nation deserve a fair accounting of the spending decisions that have led to this request. Let me be clear. The President's desire for a larger level of public debt is a consequence of the fiscal policy choices that he and a Democratic Congress have made over the last 2 years. Between 2007 and 2010, Democrats enjoyed unprecedented control over federal policy. When the President was inaugurated 2 years ago, he set to work with historic majorities in both the House and Senate. Never letting a crisis go to waste, he sought a fundamental restructuring of the American economy, one in which government would play a starring role. Thanks to our founders' design, the American people were able to go to the ballot box and give their opinion about these spending policies. Unfortunately, the administration and its allies did not curb their spending in response to Democratic uprisings. The people spoke first in Virginia and New Jersey, then in Massachusetts, and finally last summer nationwide. But the Democrats, rather than adjust their policies accordingly, just kept on spending. The tab for this binge is almost beyond description. In the 2 years that the Democrats controlled Washington, our debt has risen by almost $3 trillion. Let's look at that. $3 trillion. I have a chart documenting these staggering hikes in the debt chart, in the debt limit. This chart shows just how out of control we are. During the short period of all Democratic rule, the law was changed to raise the debt ceiling on 3 separate occasions. On February 17, 2009, President Obama signed a debt limit increase bill of $789 billion, the cost of the stimulus bill at that time. On December 28, 2009, President Obama signed a debt limit increase bill of $290 billion. And on February 12, 2010, President Obama signed a third debt limit increase of $1.9 trillion. These dollar figures, in terms of the percentage of the economy they represent, are breathtaking. I, like most other members on both sides of the aisle, eagerly await the President's State of the Union address. The President is a gifted speaker, and in his usual eloquent manner, I'm sure he will skillfully lay out his fiscal and economic policy goals. As the incoming ranking Republican on the Finance Committee, let me be the first to say that Republicans are happy to hear the President contemplating serious deficit reduction proposals. We would be overjoyed if he actually took a stand for a meaningful attack on structural deficits and the debt. But we will judge his proposals harshly if they provide mere window dressing rather than bold efforts to address a spending trajectory that is approaching crisis status. Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, or infamous bank robber, was asked why he robbed banks. By the way, here's a chart depicting the photo of Mr. Sutton from Life.com. That's Willie Sutton, the great bank robber. How'd Willie respond? He allegedly said he robbed banks because that's where the money is. If President Obama wants to propose credible deficit reduction proposals, he needs to go where the deficit dollars are. And what is the source of those deficits? Taking Willie Sutton's answer to heart, where do we look for those deficits? They are in the trillions of dollars in new spending that the American taxpayer has been burdened with by this administration. Non-defense discretionary spending by itself has grown by 24% over the last couple of years. And that 24% figure does not include the stimulus bill spending. If stimulus spending is included, non-defense discretionary spending has grown by 84%. That's right, Madam President, 84%. How many typical tax-paying American families have grown their budgets by that much in the last couple of years? Let's take a look at the Gallup Weekly Survey of daily consumer spending as a comparison. Now, I have a chart which shows the trend line in daily consumer spending. As you can see, that trend line in daily consumer spending. It's a 7-day rolling average. Over here, you can see that the chart consumer spending before the financial fall of 2008 and the recession. That's right over in this side, right in here. It's running near or above $100 a day. Then what happens? Americans cut back on their extra spending. It's right here in the rest of the chart. Just look at how they've cut back. Is it any wonder Americans are telling us to cut our spending? They've cut spending. Why can't we in Washington do the same? When the President laid out his last two budgets, the loudest bipartisan applause came when he stressed fiscal discipline. That reaction should surprise no one. Though conservatives led the way, the American people understand that deficit reduction is not a partisan issue. If the promises of our Declaration of Independence and Constitution, promises of liberty and opportunity, are to mean anything for future generations, our country needs to take up deficit reduction now. Republicans are going to insist on meaningful deficit reduction as a course correction to our currently unsustainable fiscal policy and path. As our nation comes out of this painful, slow growth period, hopefully sooner rather than later, we must focus on cutting the debt, the deficit and the debt. As Republicans, we agree with the President on the priority of fiscal discipline. But deeds mean more than words, and twice the President's budget, in spite of the rhetorical nods to fiscal discipline, has gone in the direction of unpaid-for spending, new government programs and entitlements, and massive financial burdens on the next generation of American taxpayers. The numbers don't lie. The President and the Democratic leadership have dramatically expanded the deficit and piled onto the debt. 2 years ago, Republicans and Democrats dramatically disagreed on the stimulus bill. Out of all the Republicans in the House and Senate, only 3 supported the stimulus bill conference report. Along with most of my Republican colleagues, I rejected this stimulus bill for several reasons. First was the size and the form of the stimulus. Most on our side understood that $1 trillion in deficit spending was an unacceptable burden on the people who would ultimately foot the bill. Second, we questioned the focus of the stimulus. We weren't keen on trying to grow the economy by priming the government pump. Spending $1 trillion of taxpayer money on the academic theory that you have to spend money to make money was a gamble the American taxpayer could not afford. And last year, while the administration and its allies were out promoting Recovery Summer, citizens in Utah and around the country had long before figured out that the administration's stimulus bet was a big loser. Finally, what disturbed us most was the hidden fiscal burden built into this bill. Though sold as a $787 billion bill, the real cost of the stimulus was, in fact, much higher. I'm going to use a chart to show this hidden cost of the stimulus bill. This chart was produced last year but will be updated when we receive the Congressional Budget Office baseline. According to the nonpartisan CBO, if popular new programs in the stimulus bill are made permanent, the cost will be $3.3 trillion. Think about that. To use Washington speak, the greatest threat of the new stimulus bill was that it raised the baseline. This is a nifty trick if you can pull it off. Its purpose is to open any future spending cuts, no matter how modest, to withering attack. Think about it. $3.3 billion out of that so-called less than $800 billion stimulus bill. Here's how it works. First, Democrats raise spending for some program. To borrow from George Costanza, we will call it the Human Fund. After Democrats take control of Congress and the White House spending for the Human Fund goes up by 25% from $1 million to $1,250,000. Then when the people reject this spending and send Republicans to roll it back, efforts to cut that spending by a meager 5% from $1,250,000 to $1,187,500 leads all of the interest groups dependent on this federal money to scream that the sky is falling. An attack on the Human Fund is an attack on all that is decent in this country. Never mind that this program is still substantially better off than before the Democrats' massive increase in spending. All that we hear is that Republicans are ruthlessly seeking to cut 5% from this program's budget, and so it goes. Our deficit and debt continue to grow as irresponsible and unaffordable increases in spending are baked into our budgetary cake. This strategy of raising the baseline is on full display in the stimulus bill, and the threat that its program, sold to the public as temporary, will become permanent. This chart details CBO's analysis of the stimulus. As you can see, the first column is the basic cost of the bill. If the Making Work Pay refundable tax credit is extended, there's $571 billion more in future deficits. This is the second column right here, if they extend that. If the new entitlement spending and the stimulus made permanent, then the cost of the bill more than doubles. It means almost $1 trillion in new hidden entitlement spending right here. In the fourth column, we have the appropriations spending. If those increases become permanent, there is $276 billion in new non-defense discretionary appropriations in this bill. That's right here. Finally, we have the rent in all this borrowed money. That's the interest expense. The CBO tells us that the interest cost alone on the overt new spending and the hidden new spending from the stimulus totals $744 billion. That's just the interest alone. Total it all up, total all these columns up, and you get $3.3 trillion in spending, not the $787 billion. The total cost of the stimulus is $3.3 trillion. Our nation can simply no longer afford this. Madam President, these are CBO figures, Congressional Budget Office figures. The CBO head, who I happen to admire, happens to be a Democrat. Madam President, these CBO figures are not from a conservative think tank. There are a couple of simple ways for the stimulus bill supporters to support this trajectory. If they want to keep the long-term cost of the stimulus down, they could agree to make all of the stimulus provisions temporary. Or they could agree to make all of the stimulus provisions temporary. Or they could agree to offset extensions of stimulus spending with other spending cuts. But our friends on the other side have done just the opposite. They've insisted on extending the policy in the stimulus bill without offsets in the areas of spending. Madam President, you recall then National Economic Council Director Larry Summers' 3 T's, tests for stimulus. To be effective, the stimulus needed to be timely, targeted, and temporary. That's what it needed to be. It is failure on the third T, the temporary test, which has been very troubling. 2 years into this failed economic experiment, and Democrats still refuse to agree that temporary stimulus proposals should remain temporary. The path forward is not going to be easy. While we do have a recent example of deficit reduction, it was not generated by this administration or its congressional allies. If you want to look at enacted legislation over the last decade, there is one significant spending reduction bill. It was the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005. It contained a modest amount of deficit reduction. The deficit reduction attained was $35 billion. And how did we achieve these savings? That bill was accomplished through reconciliation. The other side opposed it in lockstep. In the end, only Republican votes carried that standalone deficit reduction measure. Yet now, American taxpayers are being asked to believe that Democrats have found religion on deficits and debt. Our friends on the other side will no doubt say, time out. We've produced a significant deficit reduction bill, they will say. They will point to last year's Obamacare legislation. They will argue that this bill, which creates massive new entitlements, somehow saves money. Our Democratic friends will even cite a CBO score showing $230 billion in deficit reduction from this bill. This assertion does not pass the laugh test. Anyone who looks beyond the basic score will see that Obamacare is another huge deficit generator that will burden the American taxpayer for generations to come. House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan released an analysis derived from CBO data that tells the full story of Obamacare's deficit impact. Here's what Chairman Ryan said, and I quote, "Claims of deficit reduction exclude the $115 billion needed to implement the law. The score double counts $521 billion from Social Security payroll taxes, Class Act premiums, and Medicare cuts. It strips a costly doc fix provision that was included in initial score. It measures 10 years of revenues to offset 6 years of new spending. There is no question that the creation of a new trillion-dollar open-ended entitlement is a fiscal train wreck. Add it all up, and the fiscal reality is that Obamacare busts the budget by $701 billion. I ask unanimous consent that a copy of Chairman Ryan's analysis be inserted in the record at this point.